I'm really enjoying my experience with GOGA. I was sort of one of the hosts back in 2013 when 7 or 8 Guyanese people, business people, came to Newfoundland, and I'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow, but they came to see how we did it or how we do it. And then they left, and everything went quiet for a while, and then Liza 1 was drilled in 2015, so my phone started to ring, and I was flattered and honored to be invited back to Guyana and assist the board of directors and the establishment, and we modeled it around the Newfoundland Oil and Gas Industries Association, which has just celebrated its 40th anniversary, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then I was invited back again in January to assist with the development of this conference, and as we were talking earlier, we, Bobby and Anand and Nigel and the rest of the directors, we said, I wonder if we'd get 200 people to show up to a conference in Guyana. The money guys around the boardroom tell us, oh, Jesus, we're not going to make any money off this. So we're very extremely happy, and I speak on behalf of I think I'm the only Newfoundland member of the board of directors of GOGA. So I'm very happy to be here tonight, to be here all week. And for someone who lives on the east coast of Canada, the opportunity to not only introduce Alison, but to meet her is one that I wouldn't normally have in Canada, so I've got to come to Guyana to meet such a fine lady as Alison Redford. Alison served as Premier of Alberta from 2011 to 2014 and led the Canadian Energy Strategy, which addresses a true Canadian agenda on regulatory planning for the energy industry, together with partners on climate change, renewable energy, a post-carbon economy, innovation, energy literacy, as well as an alternate energy economy. Her government introduced the Alberta Energy Regulator, which is an integrated regulator that deals directly with industry and communities to manage environmental outcomes, resource conservation, economic development, and First Nations consultation on all energy upstream projects in Alberta. And for those that don't know it, that don't know Canada, Alberta still, despite the fact we in Newfoundland would like to be called the energy capital of Canada, Alberta is still the energy capital of Canada. Most oil companies that work offshore East Coast still have their head offices. The importance of regulation to investor confidence, competitiveness, and a managed approach to environmental sustainability and climate change signals the change to how energy regulation on major projects is managed and set a new standard globally. Ms. Redford is a strong proponent for the integrated policy planning and stakeholder development to ensure long-term economic success in energy-producing countries. She is an active voice on institutional and public sector reform based on inclusive policy development in the areas of climate change, renewable energy strategies, and trade development. She has worked on bilateral and multilateral projects related to constitutional development, telecommunications, energy sector regulations, judicial training, local government infrastructure planning, and community development. Prior to entering politics, Alison worked mainly on institutional change and public sector reform and governance of regulatory institutions in post-conflict situations, including South Africa, Afghanistan, Bosnia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, on behalf of the United Nations, the Commonwealth, and the European Union. Her professional experience includes Director of Regulatory Strategy and Development for SPOOL, which is a world-class company based in Calgary, works all around the world, has offices, I understand, in Colombia and Brazil. She's currently an advisor to Minister Abbasi on gas sector reform, the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Resources in Pakistan, and that's on behalf of the World Bank. She's a current member of the Conference Board of Canada. She's currently on a panel of experts for legal and constitutional reform for the Commonwealth Secretariat. She is a member of the International Petroleum Negotiators, and as noted before, she was Premier of Alberta, the oil capital of Canada, from 2011 to 2014. She served as Minister of Justice and Attorney General in Alberta from 2008 to 2011. She served as an International Election Commissioner for Afghanistan in 2005. She was appointed a Queen's Counsel in 2008, and she's a fine lady. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Alison Redford.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And Rob, thank you very much for reading that entire thing. I didn't actually think you would. I don't know who wrote it, I have to say, but it just makes me sound very old. And I guess maybe I am a little bit. My goodness, it's so wonderful to be here, and I want to thank the Board of Directors of GOGA. It was wonderful to see so many honorable ministers here, the Prime Minister speaking today to talk about the future of this wonderful country. I will say honestly that I've only been here for a day, and I've loved every minute of it. This conference is groundbreaking. And I'll go back a little bit to talk about Alberta in a moment, but what I really wanted to start with was the fact that what is happening right now in Guyana to me is truly unique, in that you have an opportunity in the year 2017 to have people who can come from all over the world and be honest about their mistakes and learn from their mistakes. There are people, obviously, around the world that are talking about the wonderful discoveries that are being made by ExxonMobil, companies like Echo Atlantic, which, of course, is a Canadian company as well. There are service providers here that are from all over the world. We have a wonderful delegation from Canada here, and, of course, the strong relationship with Newfoundland. You know, Bobby reminded me that in 2014 he was part of a delegation to Alberta to take a look at our sovereign wealth fund, which is the only subnational sovereign wealth fund in the world. And it's wonderful to be able to be in a country that is so optimistic about what happens in the future. I'll tell you a little bit about Alberta, in that we are one of 12 provinces in Canada. We are the holder of the third largest oil reserves in the world, after Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. As of 2014, our proven reserves were 166 billion barrels, and we produce out of the oil sands approximately 2.3 million barrels a day. In 2013, which was the highest investment level so far, $32.7 billion was invested in the oil sands, and that included very large multinational acquisitions from interests in China and around the world. We operate in a high-cost basin, and as a result of that, as Canadians, we've developed some fairly unique technologies which I think over time might be very interesting for Guyana to take a look at. Alberta itself has a very small population compared to other provinces in Canada. Not quite as small as Guyana's, but we're about 3.5 million people. And so I think about some of the experiences that you were about to go through and what I've learned about your country in the last day and a half. I got in a taxi yesterday, and I asked the taxi driver what he knew about the discoveries offshore. And he told me he was excited, and he was excited because this discovery meant jobs. And this discovery meant he was sure that the price of his gas that he put in his taxi would be subsidized. He thought that there would be wonderful infrastructure, that people who had perhaps left Guyana in the last 10 or 15 years would come back, and basically the future was coming up roses. And I think he's probably right to be optimistic about the future, but I will tell you, and for anyone in this room who is a politician, that is a very dangerous scenario. There are so many, excuse me, there are so many choices to make in Guyana right now. There is so much activity, and what we saw today from the presentations was people that are talented and well-meaning and want to make this wonderful set of discoveries useful and helpful and something that will contribute to Guyana's long-term goals and interests in a way that you've never experienced before. We heard yesterday from the minister about lots of legislation that's being put in place, lots of support coming from the Commonwealth Secretariat, from Chatham House, from bilateral programs like our bilateral program that our Canadian High Commissioner Pierre Giroux is running. Lots of technical assistance, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. We heard about regulatory frameworks this afternoon, occupational health and safety, environment. We heard wonderful information about geological opportunities. I'm going to guess that this audience is probably fairly similar to many people who live in this country. It's a lot of information coming very quickly, some of which you are very familiar with, and other information that you may not know a lot about. And when you look at a country of 750,000 people, and the sorts of resources that are about to be developed, the expectations of the public, and the international attention that you are developing and gaining, there's a lot of work to be done. It's clear to me from listening to your ministers and the Prime Minister that they understand how much work has to be done, and that it all has to be done in a very short time. I'll tell you that from our perspective in Canada, it's important to get this done. It's important to get it done right. And it's important for it to be done in a thoughtful manner. When I was the Premier of Alberta, I was part of an association that included all of the premiers in Western Canada and most of the premiers or governors in the Western United States. And in about 2012, so only 5 years ago, I went to a conference and we were talking about many of these same issues, oil and gas exploration in our jurisdictions. And about 3/4 the way through the meeting, very similar to what happened here this afternoon, someone stood up and said, "How come we're not talking about the environment?" And one of the governors on stage, I can't remember his name, but he was from Idaho. They produce potatoes, and his nickname was Buck. And he said, "Yeah, you know, the next time we have a conference on oil and gas, we should invite one of those environmentalists." And everyone nodded their head and thought, yeah, that's a really good idea. And the reason I say that to you is because what we have learned in Canada, even though we have had regulation for 100 years, and a very close relationship with industry, and an understanding of how important energy is to our economic growth, that it's very important to understand the partnership that must exist between your political leadership and industry, with your regulator, and with the community. And every time that I say that, I feel like I'm being mother hen. I served as Premier in a province that had a lot of oil and gas to get to market. And we had plans 10 years ago to build at least 5 pipelines to get that gas to market. We had the supply to put in the pipeline, we had the money to build it, we had fairly good political support across the country, most people thought. And today in 2017, only one of those pipelines has even been approved, let alone built. And the reason for that, which I think Canadians are coming to learn now, is that without a clear understanding of everyone working together on what your goals are for this wonderful resource that you have, there will be misunderstanding, miscommunication, and perhaps not quite enough trust to make this project as successful as it can be for Guyana. It was very interesting today to hear such a technical set of presentations in the morning, and I'm sure that for some in this room it was not only something you know about, but language that you're familiar with. I'm not one of those people. I'm a lawyer. A friend of mine said that He had had 3 jobs in the world that his mother would be embarrassed by. He'd been a lawyer, a politician, and now he's a banker. So I thought, okay, I've been a lawyer, I've been a politician, I'm sure I'll never be a banker. But what I know from my experience as a lawyer, being a politician, and the work that I did in development before I ever went into politics, is that if you haven't built that trust and that common understanding about what the goals are and what you want to do as a country with this wonderful resource, that there will be lots of challenges along the way. And without that goal, and without being able to remind each other why you came together to build this incredible economy, it truly can slow down what needs to be done. And of course, so much of what needs to be done in Guyana needs to be done quickly and will be done quickly. When I think about that, and I think about the conversation this afternoon after the very technical presentations this morning, I didn't know exactly what everyone was going to say when they got up on the stage to talk about regulation. I didn't know exactly I couldn't tell from the title exactly what subjects we were going to talk about regulating. And what was interesting to me is that we talked about health and safety, which is tremendously important, and I think a lot of the people who were on the stage really are committed and understand how important that is and are doing really leading work in that area. The presentation from the EPA was very interesting and very much what people can expect from a regulator at the very beginning of their focus, which is something that's very technical, very much based in rule and regulation, and understands what, within their organization, the important environmental goals will be. The discussion that took place between the audience and the people on the stage was quite interesting to me, because it sort of played out what I've seen happening in many of the jurisdictions that I work in, and certainly the jurisdiction that I live in and that I was the premier of, where you have people who are very good at what they do and are passionate about what they do and truly believe, and probably are, doing everything for the right reasons. And then you have individuals that have particular concerns. There was a woman who spoke quite eloquently this afternoon about marine conservation. There was a gentleman that talked about concerns that he's had about sort of historic mining performance in Guyana. All of these people are going to be part of the conversation in the future. And I can't observe here as much as I can observe what happened in Canada. And that was a lot of people who were passionate and technical and knowledgeable, speaking at complete cross purposes. There's a pipeline in Canada called the Energy East Pipeline. It's a Trans-Canada pipeline, which is a very big company in Canada, and it's been in the ground out in Ontario for about 55 years. About 2 years ago, TransCanada decided that they wanted to change, they call it the pipeline reversal, but really it was to change what they were shipping through the pipeline in terms of viscosity and perhaps give themselves more flexibility in terms of whether it would stay in Canada or go south. And so they had to go through a regulatory process with our National Energy Board. Public hearings, lots of interest from the community. And I remember sitting down with someone who was a political leader from the community where one of these pipelines applications was going on. And she was very excited and very motivated, and she said, you know, before that pipeline goes in the ground, I want to know exactly what's going in that pipeline. And I said, that pipeline's been in the ground for 55 years. We're having different conversations now about energy and energy infrastructure. Part of that is a result of Indigenous communities who are very interested in how there will be social and economic impact and environmental impact on their communities. We talked about that this afternoon. It's also about communities feeling empowered and knowing that they're allowed to ask questions. You know, I think of my mother or my sister. One's a teacher, one was a homemaker. People like that will have questions about everything that's going on in this room, And they are certainly going to find space to have that discussion. In Canada, we missed the opportunity to have a real, early, honest discussion with people that we didn't understand 10 years ago would be interested in these issues. Whereas right now, here, in 2017, you have the opportunity, and you already are, starting to bring people together differently to talk about what this can mean for you and how it will impact people. The one thing I will say, and it's something that happens everywhere in the world, is that when you understand an issue well, you think that everybody else understands it as well as you do. And I'll tell you, speaking from someone who's not an engineer or a geologist or has ever run an oil and gas company, that there's really technical information about environmental impact and production and how you all do things that the public want to understand. And I'm pretty sure that over the future development of this economy, that there will be lots of people who will stand up in public meetings and ask you, whatever your capacity you might be standing at the front of the room in, questions that seem absolutely ridiculous to you, because the answers are so easy. I would encourage you to take the time to build a foundation so that everyone can be part of the discussion. Because I've lived in a jurisdiction where people that understood, really truly understood this, would say, oh, don't worry, we've got that covered. Don't worry about it, it's fine. Well, people will worry. And they'll worry because they care about their community, they care about what they're reading in the newspapers, they see what they're seeing on social media, you know, movies about flaring and gas coming out of taps and whole towns going up in flames. And many jurisdictions in the world came to this discussion later and haven't been able to capture a common conversation. But I think here in Guyana you can do that, partly because you have a community that's so invested in the success of these explorations, partly because you have a population that can talk to each other and share ideas, and partly because GOGA has understood, in terms of the people that have been invited to this meeting, who has to be at the table. Political leadership will need to decide what they believe the people of Guyana want for policy choices. It's a pretty simple process. You set a policy goal, then you pass laws to implement the policy, then you pass regulations so that everyone understands how they're supposed to work so that those policies get implemented, and then you create regulators. The regulator's job is to follow the rules and make sure that everyone who has to be regulated follows the rules. It sounds really simple. I'll tell you that that gap between where political leadership makes the policy and what the rules say can take 100 different turns. I would suggest, from my experience as being a person who was elected in public office, that the creation of that policy is probably one of the most dynamic and important conversations that you can have. But once that policy's been set, I've certainly seen the development of rules be more successful when everyone has been involved all the way along. I don't think that anywhere in the world there will be a time where the technical experts will be able to set a framework and simply implement that framework without a different kind of engagement with people. And I'll tell you that when I talk about this in Canada, I'm always concerned that people think, oh, we do that, we consult, we have rules. I do work in Peru. They have a wonderful set of legislation with respect to consultation with indigenous people. But at the end of the day, they have pipelines in northern Peru that are leaking that they can't repair because the community doesn't trust government enough to come in and fix those leaks. As we were building our pipelines in Canada, I would talk to industry and say, have you thought about doing consultation in a way that gets you faster results. Oh, no, we're doing that. 45% of our budget is consultation. Well, that's great. But it's not consultation yet that's connecting with people. COP21 was a great success in terms of environmental policy. First time in the history of our world that all nations came together and set policy goals with respect to climate change. There were, I'm going to get my numbers slightly wrong, but let's say there were 175 countries represented sitting in the room. Probably in this room. You could have 175 decision makers from 175 countries sitting and deciding exactly what that policy should be. I don't know, was anyone at COP21? So, COP21 also had a community consultation process that 40,000 people showed up, usually on their own dime, to be part of, where they talked about what was important in their communities, to their organizations, to their families, and to their countries. And I would suggest to you that one of the reasons that COP21 was successful is because the delegations from those 178 countries finally understood that it was important to partner in dialogue with those 40,000 people. Because you'll remember other climate conferences where the protesters were out on the street and the decision makers were behind gates. And they didn't work. But now we're living in a world, and you have just entered this world, where social media, international discussion, environmental activists, community advocates are able to access citizens around the world and find people that have common interest, and are able to encourage people and empower people to be part of a dialogue about how things like energy development can happen. So what I would say is that here in Guyana, you are starting from a different place. You are certainly starting from a different place than we started in Alberta. We had a legacy of over 100 years of energy development. We had 4 regulators in place. And we decided that we needed to bring them together so that the conversation that was taking place with industry was about how projects were affecting all parts of a community. When we did that, we started to see a better dialogue with communities. We were always able to move regulatory approval through, but in terms of pushback, we've seen a significantly different approach with respect particularly to upstream development around places like Fort McMurray. There was a really interesting comment today when we were talking about the EPA, and I noted it because it was part of the debate that was going on in the audience, where someone was asking, was it Anila, about the legislation. And she said, oh, but you know, we're doing all that, we're drafting this legislation. And then she said, but we have to just give it to the policymakers. And someone said, but are you talking to the policymakers about this? And I wrote it down because, as I said before, that discussion between the regulator and the policymaker is probably the most fundamental relationship that you can develop to get a regulatory process that will allow investors to have confidence, for clarity around climate goals, for an understanding with community as to what this will mean in terms of economic success. And you need to have all 4 of those partners at the table. That's certainly been our experience in Canada. You know, one of the things that's very good, I'm very proud of the fact that I'm Canadian, and one of the things that I always joke about, but it actually is true, is that we will be very honest about what we don't do well, because we don't want other people to make those same mistakes. And it's very easy for people to come and say that perhaps the models that we have might work here. They won't, because you need to build your model. You have to build an appropriate model that takes into account how your community will interact, how your industry will talk to the community, how your political leadership will interact with industry and the community. Those are unique circumstances here in Guyana that you will deal with. All we can do is, from Canada, is offer perspective with respect to that. I would say that today was, from my perspective and my experience, a wonderful model to look at how to begin. And I hope that you can continue to do that. And I know that if you can do that, the most important thing that you will build is trust. I don't know how to express more earnestly the number of times that I've been part of conversations where people say, yeah, I know that. I understand that. I understand you're telling me I have to build trust. And then they go away and do things the way that they always used to. And without that trust, it may not be today and it may not be tomorrow, but when you first face those challenges, it will be more difficult to overcome them. We've learned those lessons in Canada. They're pretty fundamental. It's sort of intuitive if you think about it. But I would say roll up your sleeves and understand that there will be many people who are part of the conversation who not only will you not agree with, but you'll probably believe that they're not fully informed or they only have part of the story. They will continue to be part of your dialogue, and finding ways to accept those voices and to see how to move forward is going to make the long-term prospects for economic development in the energy sector profoundly different here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alison. I think we learned a lot here tonight from Alison and her experience in the oil and gas industry, and thank you for recognizing that GOGA is putting its best foot forward in ensuring that we bring everybody to the table for the discussion of the development of our oil and gas industry. Since our launch, we've always indicated that we want to be an inclusive organization of all stakeholders and ensuring that information is shared and knowledge is represented by Guyana as a country learning and being able to take care of itself in a sustainable manner.